Hello and welcome back to the Amazing Collection and the Book of Ruth. As you know, we are in the historic books. There are 17 historical books in the Old Testament. Ruth is the 8th book. Ruth is only one of 2 books that are named after women. So you know what that means? You gotta read it. No, you will be blessed by it. It's only 4 little chapters. Now, it's thought to be authored by Samuel, the prophet. And he probably had a few reasons for penning this book. One, so that everyone could see God's faithfulness in the line of David. 2, because it is the perfect picture of the Old Testament fulfillment of the kinsman redeemer, which is the theme of our whole book. And thirdly, and I want you to hear this, he wanted you to see, he wanted me to see, what a difference one godly woman could make. Not just in a family, not just in a community, not just in a city or in a nation, but in the entire world and into the future. This is what the book of Ruth is about. Now, the interesting thing to me is that it was not taking place in the time of David, it took place in the time of the judges, which you just learned about. So you already know that it was evil and bloody and full of unrest. It was a dark period marked by unfaithfulness, which is why this little book of Ruth shines so brightly. It's a book of light and love and of hope. We have a short little outline for you today. 3 little divisions. The first division is the heathen. I just like saying that, the heathen. That is chapter 1, and that's about Ruth. We're going to introduce you to Ruth. The second chapter, the second division, is chapters 2 and 3, and that's about Boaz, our boy Boaz. He is the kinsman redeemer pictured in this story. And then the third division is the heir. And the heir is Obed, the child Obed. And that is chapter 4. So if you haven't already turned in your Bibles and turned in your workbooks to the book of Ruth, the 8th book of your Bible, please do so, because we want to jump right in. I don't want you to miss anything today. What I'd like to start with in the first division is the history. Now, I know you're going to read it and you're going to jump right in there and enjoy the text. But to make it more meaningful, I want to give you some background information. Some things that aren't written in that the reader, the Jewish reader of that time, would have already known. For example, the little family we meet is from Bethlehem. Bethlehem means the house of bread, except that the house had no bread. They were in the middle of a famine. And this little family, whose head of the family was Elimelech. And Elimelech, by the way, means my God is king. That is important because at this time, remember, it took place in the time of the judges. The judges ruled Israel, but they were really a theocracy. God was their king, and every other nation knew it. God was the king. But Elimelech had 2 sons, and their names were Mahlon and Chilion. Mahlon means weakly. Chilion means failing or pining. Now, the reason I'm giving you these definitions is because in the ancient East, remember, their names either told you who they worshiped, where they were from, or something about their character. Now, we can pretty well surmise that if their names were weakly, sickly, pining, and failing, these weren't 2, hunky warriors. And that might give us an insight as to why they wanted to flee Bethlehem during the time of the famine. And with their mama, whose name is Naomi. And Naomi means lovely and pleasant. Now, this mama may have been looking at her sons thinking, Elimelech, they're not going to make it. They're not going to make it through the famine. Why don't we just leave for a short time and take them somewhere that is full of sheep and goat and lush fields? And so off to Moab they go. Now, to you and I, that doesn't sound like too bad of a deal. Hey, they got all the food, they got all the goats. But to the Jewish reader, that would have been a bad choice. Moab was probably not at the top of God's famine relocation list because the Moabites were their enemies. They were their arch enemies. to use modern day terminology. We met the Moabites back in Genesis, but you may not have recognized them. Do you remember Lot, Abraham's nephew? The Moabites are the descendants of his incestuous relationship with his daughters. These people are the product of Lot and his daughter. Now, that's their beginnings. You can imagine what they turned into. We meet them again in Numbers. When Moses was trying to bring the Israelites through the land of Moab, not only did they block him from going in, but remember the king hired Balaam and his talking donkey to go and curse them. And then they tried to seduce them into idolatry. But most recently to this text, during the time of Judges, the Moabites had actually invaded Israel and conquered her for 18 years. They were cruel, cruel rulers. They would wipe out their villages and kill their people. So that kind of puts their little journey in a different context, doesn't it? In Naomi's mind, they're going off to Moab for a short time, but they get there, and her husband, Elimelech, dies. We have to assume this was her beloved, her rock, her pillar, and he's gone. And then she suffers what any mother, any true Israelite mother, would think almost worse. Her sons, Mahlon and Chilion, take Moabite women to be their wives. We can't understand the heartache and the confusion she must have been feeling, because her little stay turned into 10 long years. And at the end of those 10 years, Mahlon and Chilion also die. Do you just feel the pain in that? The hopelessness, the helplessness that she was facing? All of her men, in her eyes, all of her hope was gone. And yet it's also at this time Naomi hears that Israel is beyond the famine. There's wheat in the land, there's barley, they're having a huge harvest, and she decides it's time to go home. It's time to go home. And so she and her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, begin going back to Bethlehem. Can't you just hear God wooing them? Come home. Come home, my daughter, my broken-hearted one. Come home. But for some reason along the trip, she stops and says, go, my daughters, go back while you have the chance. Go and marry Moabite men. Have their children. You still have a chance. Go back. Now, what she's referring to, it sounds odd to you and I, especially if when you're reading this text and it says things like, even today, if I had hoped to marry someone and have 2 sons, what are you going to do? Wait for them? She is referring to a common practice. And I want to break this down for you because I want you to grasp this concept now. She is referring to the kinsman redeemer. Kinsman just means male relative. And the kinsman meant on the husband's side of the family, on the man's side of the family. Now in Texas, we didn't call them male relatives, we called them kinfolk. Maybe that'll help you remember it. The kinsman redeemer. Well, to redeem means to buy back, to pay a price, to reclaim ownership. Kinsman redeemer. In Genesis, Leviticus, and also in Deuteronomy, we see this carried out in 2 different ways. For example, if a man became bankrupt and had to sell his property, he could go to his rich kinsman and say, will you buy this land back for me? Remember, to the Israelites, the land was so important. That was part of their heritage. And if the kinsmen were related, if he were able, in other words, if he were free and rich enough, and if he were willing, those are the 3 requirements, then he would go and buy back that land and give it to the man who had lost it, his cousin or his brother. And the family would get to stay on that land, and it would go down through generation after generation. That's one way to redeem, to buy back. And in this book, we see that way. But we also see another way. And this is what's different to you and I. The other way this can work out is if a man, I will be the man, takes a wife and he dies, that widow goes to his brother. Now, this is only if he is a male relative, if he's related, and brothers are, if he is able, if he is free, and he is able monetarily to support her, provide for her, care for her, protect her, and if he's willing. Because when they come together as man and wife, that offspring stays under the name of his dead brother. Are you following me? And then that way, that woman gets to raise that child in her first husband's name, and that property, that inheritance, moves on through that line. The line doesn't die just because he did. They have been redeemed. Well, that is what Naomi is referring to. But see, she kind of has it wrong. She thinks, because of her brokenheartedness, because of her perspective, and she feels like she has no hope for a kinsman redeemer. But in a way, she's right. She cannot do that for them, but our great big God can. I wish she had paused and just reconsidered the plan. Perhaps God was doing all of this just to woo her home, just to bring her back to the birthplace of redemption. But it's here we find her, sad and broken. But it's also here that we find that hope begins. Because upon hearing this, Orpah considered it and thought, she's probably right. And they wept and they hugged, and she walked off the pages of history forever. But Ruth said the best thing I've ever heard, the best words ever penned. I'm going to read them to you. They're in your Bible, and they're in chapter 1, verse 16. Ruth looks at Naomi and says, "Do not urge me to leave or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God, my God." She accepts the Lord as her God on the spot. She calls him her Redeemer on the spot. She must have seen something worthy in her mother-in-law and in her own husband to have made that commitment. And it's such a great picture of God in his mercy and his protection, because until she has an earthly Redeemer, he acts as one and gets them safely. Ruth and Naomi have safe travel back to Bethlehem. Have you ever thought about how Ruth felt standing there? Ruth, who had given up her country, her mother, her father, her language, her people, any hope, as far as they knew, of marrying again, to come to a foreign land where she doesn't even have citizenship. She gave up her gods to be with her broken mother-in-law. Read verse 1 in chapter 2. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth. Now get that, that's two parts of the kinsman and redeemer. A relative of her husband and a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Well, when we meet the two ladies, Ruth comes to Naomi and says, "I'm going to go and glean in the fields." And instead of saying to her, "Well, be careful, my daughter," or "Can I pack you a lunch?" or giving her any advice on where to go, she just says, "Go, my daughter." And the text says, Ruth just happens into the field of Boaz. Isn't God great? Can't you just feel the plot thickening? And so she's there, and she's in the fields. Now, if you know anything about farming and the gleaning process, you know in those days they used sickles. The men would usually use sickles and cut down first the barley, that would be the first part of the harvest, and then the wheat. And behind them, usually women, would be gathering the stalks, or what we call straw, and bundling them up and putting them on a cart. Behind them, if the landowner was godly and compassionate and good and gracious, which we see Boaz is, there would be the widows and the poor and the orphans and the aliens gleaning up the shafts that were behind to beat out later and to bring home. That's the way God designed it. And of course, Boaz is keeping it that way. Ruth is there and she's working. And Boaz comes to the field, and being a man concerned about people, he yells to the people, "The Lord be with you." And they yell, "And also with you." And he calls the foreman over, and instead of saying, "So how much wheat do you think we got, Frank?" he says, "Who is the woman over there?" And the foreman says, "Oh, that's Ruth. the Moabitess, the one who came back to take care of her mother-in-law, Naomi. She has been working so hard all day. And Boaz calls her over. And Boaz offers her provision and protection. He says, I don't want you over there by yourself. I want you up here with my maids. And when you're thirsty, come and drink from my water. And she falls on her face and says, why have I found favor in your eyes? And he says, because I've heard of the good that you have done for your mother-in-law. And I think there's another reason too, that he had some experience with how hard it was being a foreign woman in a foreign land. He himself was a half-breed. Remember back in the book of Joshua, when the two spies were sent to Jericho, and they hid out in Rahab the harlot's home? Rahab is Boaz's mama. He was showing her favor that I'm sure he'd seen other people show to his mother. He was engulfing her into the family of God. She was not the Moabitess anymore. She was the maid. And then later, this is so cute, he calls her over for a picnic. He lets her sit at his table. He feeds her, he serves her, and he finds out that she is, in fact, a woman of integrity. And then he goes over to the field hands and says, listen, I do want to protect her. I want to make sure you guys don't harass her, and also pull some extra straws out. Leave them behind so she can gather in abundance. And that day, Ruth gathers a week's worth of barley. She gathers it up, beats it out, and brings it home to Naomi. A week's worth. And Naomi says, my daughter, where have you been this day? And she says, in the field of Boaz. And Naomi starts to get it. I want you to look with me in verse 20 of chapter 2. Naomi says, may he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living or the dead. And then she looks at Ruth and says, that man, he is our relative. He is one of our closest relatives. Can't you just hear the wheels turning? She tells her, I want you to stay in his field as one of the maids. The harvest lasts 4 months. You stay close to Boaz. And Ruth does. Isn't this beautiful? In little pieces, God is bringing her, this empty woman, fullness. Fullness in hope, fullness actually in wheat. Well, Naomi gets her chance to put her plot into action in the first part of chapter 3. She calls Ruth to her, and she says, all right, the harvest is over. I want you to do something to secure your future. This is an act of love. She says, starting in verse 3, wash yourself, anoint yourself, put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. It shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet. Now that was so that they would get cold and he would wake up. You shall uncover his feet and lay down. And Ruth, the maid, says, I will do all you say. This was a big deal. This was not inappropriate, but this was a big deal because she is going to be giving him permission to pursue her. Washing was rarely done. They didn't have the water for it. Anointing was only done for special occasions, times set aside, sanctified. And then her own mother-in-law gives her permission to quit mourning her son. Take off your mourning clothes and put on bride's clothes. And she sent her off into the night. And Ruth does exactly as her mother-in-law asks. And in the night, as she's laying at Boaz's feet, he gets a little surprise. And in verse 9, he says, who are you? And she answers, I am Ruth, your maid. Isn't that precious? She does not say, I am Ruth the Moabitess. I am Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative. It's such a sweet picture. I hope you can feel the moment. She must have been scared out of her wits. And he was so flattered and honored. And he does just that. He spreads his covering over her. It's the same phrase, it's the same expression as put covering with your wing, which is a blessing he himself had uttered over Ruth in the field. That is still practiced in the East today. And then he says, listen, my daughter, being a man of integrity, he says, I am not the closest relative. I've got to get something right first. But I promise you, this day I will secure you a kinsman redeemer. One way or another, your land will be bought back. Your name will be bought back. Mahlon and Elimelech will have an inheritor. They will have a benefactor. They will be able to pass on their name. I promise you that this day. So rest. Rest to this young woman who has lost her husband, her brother-in-law, her father-in-law, who has traveled all this way and has worked like a dog gleaning for 4 months. He says, rest. And she does. And then he wakes her up in the morning before she could be discovered and her reputation tarnished, and he sends her off with 80 pounds of grain because he did not want her to come home to Naomi empty-handed. He wanted to show Naomi God's fullness. Isn't that sweet? Now, I'll tell you what, her first husband may have been named Weakland, but if he sent her off with 80 pounds of grain, she was anything but. And so there the ladies are in the house together, waiting. And by this time, even Naomi has hope. She says, we will wait because this man will do what he says this very day. And he goes to the city gate. Now that is where they hold all of the major business in the city. And he brings with him 10 elders because you needed 10 witnesses for any legal transaction. And he, being a man of character, wanted to do this thing right. So there they are, and he sees the closest relative, and he says, listen, Naomi wants someone to redeem her land, to buy back her land, to pay the price for it. Are you interested? You're the closest relative, and if you're not, I'd like a shot at it. And the guy stops and thinks, and, you know, I could put a whole other couple acres on there. I might make myself some money. Yeah, I'll buy it. I'll redeem that land. And Boaz says, okay, but remember, Ruth the Moabitess goes with the package. You're going to have to marry her and give Mahlon and Elimelech heirs. And the closest relative thinks about it again. Probably something like, ooh, I don't think my wife would like that. And declines the offer. And he hands Boaz his sandal, which was like, okay, let's shake on it. He hands the sandal, and with accepting that sandal, Boaz accepts the role of the kinsman redeemer. In the background, you could probably hear the villagers going, go into the chapel and we're gonna get. And sure enough, Boaz and Ruth marry. Look at verse 13 in chapter 4. 13 of chapter 4. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. He went to her, and the Lord enabled them to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. I love this part. Read on with me. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today. May his name become famous throughout Israel, which it does. May he also be a great restorer of your life, sustainer in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, listen to this, who loves you is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him today. 7 sons was the perfect Jewish family. And the name of that boy she gave birth to that day was Obed, which means servant. He served the Redeemer for the rest of his life. Every child of redemption is a servant. And oh, our sweet Ruth, she's waited so long for the fulfillment of this. She has been there to undergird her mother-in-law when she was broken and hopeless. And now she has the fulfillment of a promise. I want to tell you a little bit more about this baby, Obed. Obed grew to be a man, and he had a son, and that son's name was Jesse. Jesse had 8 sons, the youngest of whom was named David. David had many generations of sons, and the most famous child of the redemption is Jesus, the Christ. See, ladies, this isn't just merely a love story, it is a love letter. It is a letter written to you and to me. It is a letter that Jesus himself wrote in his word, on the cross, and in blood. You may be thinking, no, not for me. I'm too hopeless. I'm too broken. I have too many flaws. And he's saying, come, brokenhearted. Come, heathen. Come home. Come and be my heirs. Do you know, he is a relative. He became man. He is more than able. He is all-powerful and sinless. And he was willing unto death to redeem you and to redeem me. And then, like Ruth, all you have to do is ask, and he will cover you with his blood-stained cloak of redemption.